Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You have reached the No Name Cinema Society, the award-nominated film review show that digs just a little bit deeper. It is Thursday, September 5th, 2019, and this is episode 56.3, our classic. We are celebrating the 30th anniversary of a Best Picture Oscar winner, Driving Miss Daisy. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Betzler, one of your hosts of the No Name Cinema Society. I am back in New York in the other Astoria apartment. I'm usually in another smaller apartment. I'm in the big apartment now. I'm all over the place this summer, but I'm glad to be back in New York, and I'm glad to talk to the following gentleman about Driving Miss Daisy. First, my very ancient friend who will soon need someone to drive him around LA. Ladies and gentlemen, Devin Michaels is back.
I'm back, and I am old.
It's true. It's true. And my recommendation to drive Miss Devin around LA will be the not much younger but very safe and environmentally conscious James Monahan.
Oh, hello.
James?
Oh, sorry.
Are you in VR world? What's happening?
I was just playing Driving Miss Daisy, the VR game, where you drive a series of cranky and bitter old ladies. It's all the rage. It's, even better than Halo.
I guess that's a special release for its 30th anniversary.
That makes sense.
I'll have to get that.
Warner Brothers is milking this franchise for all it's worth.
Oh, yeah. It keeps paying dividends all these years later.
Before we get to the Driving Miss Daisy's discussion, let me show you guys our schedule for this, our 56th series of episodes. I can't believe we made it 56. It started a week ago tonight, August 29th, with our review of Ready or Not. And it continued on Tuesday, September 3rd, with our review of Steven Soderbergh's The Girlfriend Experience as our indie spotlight. Of course, tonight is our classic. And this upcoming Monday, September 9th, will be our 40th Sound Off. James will be there for us. We're going to have a big special announcement. Devin might make a surprise appearance. The guy that lives in this apartment likes Dos Equis, because that's what I had last time I was here. And he had a whole new six-pack in here, so this is what I'm drinking. Devin and James are generally pretty big wine drinkers, but never on the show. James, are you going to drink with me?
I'm drinking alkaline water, pH 9.5 and above.
Devin?
I'm too old and cranky to drink.
That's true. Who knows what can happen if you start to drink too much. All right, cool. So I'm going to drink, and then I'm going to do trivia. The trivia I did in the last episode said that our next classic turns 30 this year and was much discussed this past Oscar season because of its connection to one of this past year's major contenders. In fact, it was this past year's Best Picture winner, Green Book, that was described by me and others as a reverse Driving Miss Daisy. So Driving Miss Daisy was very much in the news and the discussion of last year's films. And I imagine the comparison will come up more than once this evening. Gentlemen, are you ready for the summary?
All right.
Yes.
Bring it on.
Daisy Wortham is a wealthy Jewish woman in Georgia who has a minor driving accident one day and is then deemed an insurance risk due to her age. Daisy's son hires Hoke, a local African-American man, to be her new driver, much to Daisy's chagrin. After she gets over her initial resistance, Daisy and Hoke form an unlikely bond as the years go by. They lean more and more on each other to cope with the rapidly changing world around them. Guys, how was that summary?
A good use of the word chagrin. I think Daisy was born chagrined.
Opening thoughts. James, you were at the screening of this, and you're also better at opening thoughts than Devin. So one sentence about how you feel about Driving Miss Daisy, because I honestly don't remember what you said at the screening.
I don't remember myself being particularly positive, and I'm afraid I'm not really going to change my tune. I mean,
Devin,
4 sentences.
We're going to have plenty of time to talk about this movie. We got a full 50-plus minutes left. Tell me in one sentence. Let's give me like a snapshot. And you did such a good job on Stuber when you did the review, the one-sentence review. You can do it again.
Overall, I think it holds up as a charming film that has a more sophisticated treatment of this subject matter than the Best Picture winner from 30 years later or 29 years later.
Okay, well, we're definitely having interesting discussions. I disagree with that statement. The screening that we had for this film was on August 18th, 2017. I used to record all of the screenings on little voice memos, but I lost my recording. James, I don't suppose you remember the general mood of the evening.
Yeah, I remember the response being a little bit lukewarm. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I get, and maybe that's why it didn't stand out to me. Like, if you put a gun to my head, I seem to recall reception was lukewarm, warm but at an arm's length, admired but not loved, if that makes sense. Does that sound about right?
I don't know. I've never stepped into a lukewarm pool that I admired. So
Fair enough. My sentence is, and I rewatched it for tonight. My one sentence is it is sweet and charming, almost to the point of being corny. And so we'll get into that, but we always like to start with the positive things. And I think the most positive thing I can say about the movie is about the performances. I mean, I think everybody is spot on, very believable and thorough. There's detail in everybody's gesture and choice. Obviously, they're all renowned actors for the most part, but you have to give some of that credit to director Bruce Beresford. Guys, first, would you agree that the performances were the highlight of the movie?
yeah, I agree. I think they were fine performances, and refreshing and revelatory to see Dan Aykroyd at the time, who I associated back then with Ghostbusters and SNL.
It's funny because when we talked about Green Book, you and I, James, both agreed that the highlight of the film is also the performances. So it's interesting they share that in common. Devin, performances.
I agree. These are excellent performances all around.
I want to start with Morgan Freeman, even though Tandy won the Oscar, because it was this screening more than any other time I've seen it that I was particularly impressed with Freeman. I mean, he's always compelling to watch and listen to, but this feels like a more fully realized and unique character than a lot of what we've seen from him since. He plays much older than he is, and he does so very believably, and he seems to really compellingly capture a man from another time and place in a very real way. That didn't necessarily clock with me in previous viewings. Devin, this feels like a different Morgan Freeman, especially we saw him last year in '88 for Clean and Sober. This is more fleshed out character than a lot of what he's been doing.
Yeah, I just rewatched it today for this, which is why I had the freeze frame ready to go and matching you. Obviously, Morgan Freeman always has tremendous screen presence, but there's something about his performance in this film that has so much nuance of just the man is not going to suffer fools, even though he's also so good at suffering fools. You know, it's like that delicate balance, and there's so many interesting choices he makes in this film. He's a character that show this, that he's someone who is good at being attentive and caring and tolerant and patient, but he's also very much has that dignity that he's not going to let go of, and he's going to speak his mind when he needs to.
And for those of you that playing the drinking game at home, like one of the things that you drink at is anytime Devin says there's something about, and he did that just now, and there's something about the nuance in his performance. So drink up, everybody at home, if you missed it.
Morgan Freeman, yeah, I agree. He does a lot with very little, and the screenwriters have given him very little to work with in terms of character development, in terms of finding out much about his life outside of the scenes he's in.
But you felt it, and it isn't. You're right. It is in his performance. Like you sensed. I mean, he comes from Macon. And you sense some of his backstory just in the way he carries himself, I think.
Yeah, totally.
In the way that he develops an affection for her as well. He's kind from the start because that's his way. But obviously that has a different glint in its eye. There's a certain, a lesser actor would play the same patient, kind man in the first couple of scenes of meeting her that he plays when they know each other for 30 years. He doesn't make that mistake.
Right. And so that moving on, we'll move on to Jessica Tandy now, who obviously she won the Best Actress Oscar. And I don't think that she hits a false note in the movie. Not that she'd necessarily be my choice to win Best Actress in 1989, but she'd certainly be a contender. I think she navigates her character's arc in a subtle and believable manner.
Yeah, especially since the arc is more like a slight bend. I don't think the character changes that much.
I was trying to be nice when I called it subtle.
I know. And if you look on the page, you could say, oh, this is a really one-note character. But I think thanks to her performance, there are more harmonies.
It sounds like we're mostly in agreement, especially you and me, James, in that the performances are the best part about this film. Sounds like you're on board with that.
I'm on board that train, JB, riding it wherever you go.
Devin, would you like to pontificate on Jessica Tandy?
Not much that you haven't already said. I don't recall what she was up against that year.
She was up against Isabella Johnny for Camille Claudel and Pauline Collins for Shirley Valentine. But the one that really stands out to me is our friend from 1988, Michelle Pfeiffer, for the Fabulous Baker Boys. That's the one that I felt like that could really challenge her. I'd have to rewatch Fabulous Baker Boys, though. But regardless, you were saying about Jessica Tandy.
Like you said, there wasn't a false note. You know, you expect not to have false notes from actors like this. But in terms of transcending their own abilities and making a performance or creating a performance that's special and stands the test of time, she added some choices over the course of this film, both ones that were just doing what the text was dictating, but then also ones that she was just deciding on her own that deepened it, that were giving us more bang for our buck as we watch.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with James that I feel like, you know, there's not as potentially much on the page, but she really made it come to life. Which brings us to the final performance of the movie. It was a surprise Oscar nomination. Not many people know that Dan Aykroyd is an Oscar-nominated actor, but he is, and he was nominated for this movie, losing to Denzel Washington in Glory. He's fine in the film. I guess all of us were surprised at the time that he was as good in a quasi-dramatic role. But I don't know if he's Oscar-worthy. Like, it's a good, solid performance. I grant you that. I don't think it's an outstanding performance. Devin?
I think maybe I appreciated his performance more than you did a little bit. There are a few moments that show that he's not as exquisite in his craft as the two other leads. Near the end, he kind of overplays the final moment of looking at the two of them and being proud of the fact that he put them together, being proud of the fact that he made that choice.
But I blame the director, too, for holding on him that long. You know what I mean? I felt like the director was lingering on that shot, and he just felt like sometimes actors, if the camera's still rolling, feel like they need to do something extra. So the director and editor should have cut out of that moment a little sooner.
Yeah, they didn't do many favors with that. There's just one or two moments like that, but overall, I really did have an affection for this man that I wouldn't have necessarily just from the page. There was something about his relationship with his wife.
You just did it again. There's something about, ladies and gentlemen, drink up.
His relationship with Patti LuPone's character was really interesting in the way of how that juxtaposes with his relationship with his own mother. Obviously, so much of the film is about him taking care of his mother, but also being the most aware person in the universe, of course, that she's a pain in the ass.
The way he tolerates the women in his life.
Yes, and so there's that, and that's nice. But I noticed in today's viewing something I completely had forgotten, which was when he accepts the award for
Man of the Year.
In that scene, something more than just I'm that guy, has a tough cookie mother, and I'm sweet about it, and gosh darn, I'm a sweet guy. There was something more there.
I liked his performance. I want to be clear. You said there's a couple false moments, and I would probably say maybe there's a half dozen. You know, that's the difference that we're talking about here. There are a couple moments that he was a little big, ever so slightly. And my main point is, in a year that featured performances like Danny Aiello in Do the Right Thing and Marlon Brando in A Dry White Season, the aforementioned Denzel Washington in Glory, Morgan Freeman in Glory, but also the unnominated James Earl Jones in a movie that was re-released in theaters earlier this year in Field of Dreams. With those things in mind, I don't know that Dan Aykroyd's performance stands up against other performances of that particular year. And not to mention a movie that you love, Martin Landau in Crimes and Misdemeanors was also nominated that year.
Right.
One of my favorite films.
So with those things in mind, I feel like Dan Aykroyd's nomination was probably undeserved. James Earl Jones in Field of Dreams is the one standout.
I think he almost certainly got helped by the fact that people wanted to honor this film in general a lot.
For sure.
And that it was a beloved play, and that his character, while certainly being supporting, is one of those characters that if people love a piece of work and love a work like this that's character driven, that's very much about performance, he's one of the top three leads. So he kind of.
I actually think a lot of it has to do with the narrative, the exterior narrative of the story of this Saturday Night Live actor trying something different and not messing it up. And that's what makes it Oscar worthy. James has not had the opportunity to talk about Dan Aykroyd, so I apologize, James, for all that time away from you. Tell me.
I mean, you guys said a lot of it. I agree that my guess is the surprise of this comic actor playing a serious role and doing it competently may have helped his nomination. I'm no longer surprised by that because I find that comic actors end up being really good dramatic actors and not the other way around. I also think Aykroyd was helped by the character. On the page and on the screen, he's not predictable. I can never really guess through the film how he's going to end up, morally, or how we're going to feel about him at the end. So he keeps us guessing. And the other thing that helps the character in his performance is the costuming. At least I read the script, and the writers put a lot of work into telling the story of the characters through costume, through what he wears. There's this awkward relationship between Bully and also his mom Daisy and wealth and privilege that plays out through the film. And a lot of that story is told through costume and the references to Dan Aykroyd's character wearing ill-fitting clothing that he's not entirely suited for as he grows more and more, with his company and ultimately becomes successful.
Well, so we covered a lot about the performances. So I'm going to segue to the direction, which go hand in hand, I think, a little bit, because I think we've already discussed the strength of the performances, and you have to acknowledge Bruce Beresford had to have been a steady hand at the helm in order to achieve or at least assist these actors through this film. But as far as the other elements of direction, this is where the movie, I have some question marks. I mean, stylistically, I feel like the film was visually lacking and slow. And both of those things can be death when you're trying to make a play cinematic. But Devin and I both saw a film at TCM Fest from the same year, also based on a play that takes place in the South that does a much better job of being cinematic. Devin, what am I talking about?
Steel Magnolias.
Exactly. Do you agree with that statement?
Steel Magnolias just has a bit more going on in its plot. Driving Miss Daisy is a decidedly simple film. I don't think that means that it's automatically failing and being cinematic. There are many moments that I was noticing today that I was impressed by how cinematic it was. I really liked when they were having that conversation by her dressing room mirror or something.
Oh, see, now I was going to bring this up as the opposite. I was going to bring this up as because the next thing I was going to say was that Beresford tried to shoehorn a visual language to the film, or an occasional off-kilter frame, or sometimes moving the camera in an unmotivated way. And while I appreciate the effort, it's distracting and it feels off-tone. Yes, it was an attempt to be cinematic, but I consider it a failed attempt to be cinematic. It's a scene in the James Knows where Aykroyd explains that he can't go to the Martin Luther King rally, and he's framed through a multi-mirror situation. I feel like that was putting the round peg into the square hole. Saying because it didn't match anything else in the film. That level of framing and shooting through mirrors, if that was part of the style that had been established, but this is a scene that takes place 3/4 in the way of the film, and it was not on par with anything else. It was completely.
But it was supposed to stand out like a sore thumb because that is the first scene in which we're getting the idea that Bewley's not a saint. He's not perfect. He's having to make tough choices. He has to face those choices. He has to face himself, indeed, as if through a mirror.
I understand how he approached the scene from a single scene work, but it also has to work within the narrative language of the film as a whole.
I don't think it was so outrageous to have Dan Aykroyd.
I disagree. I thought it was distracting. Like, if you take your viewers out of it, you're doing yourself a disservice.
Many lay people watching this film who are not filmmakers like yourself would have seen this film and not even noticed it.
Oh, I disagree. I feel like they would have noticed it and not understood why it bothered them.
Again, I think that it doesn't have to match in style, specifically because it was supposed to be a moment that stood out in terms of the plot and in terms of the character development.
To me, it's so far afield from what the rest of the film is. It needs to feel like it's a part of the same movie.
It only felt far afield because you're very sensitive to noticing directors' choices like
that.
I'm
the one giving my thoughts. Those are my thoughts. I can't see it any other way. You know what I mean?
Well,
like that's
sure,
how
but I think we're also trying we're trying to give a review speaking towards what the majority might think or not think.
No, we're trying to give our own personal feelings, and the viewers can decide who that they want who they want to listen to, or who that they feel is more aligned with their own aesthetic.
That's fair. And what I'm saying is you're an outlier, I think, in this particular issue.
So people watching, listening at home, feel free to weigh in yourself. Watch the scene and add your comments on YouTube.
Watch it along with the rest of the movie.
The rest of the film.
Point.
You're right.
Don't watch the scene. That will defeat the purpose of.
Well, this is assuming they've already watched the film, but they can go back.
Well, it's 30 years old, so if you're watching the review, I'm hoping you'll have seen it at this point. We on no review, except maybe Stuber, do we tell people not to go see a movie? Like we always say, watch the movie and decide for yourselves and agree or disagree with us. But otherwise, I think you should see everything, regardless of whether or not I like it, and especially regardless of whether or not Devin likes it.
All right, moving on.
Moving on. Okay, I had more examples, but James is right. It does feel like that discussion's played out, and that brings us to the other element that I think James and I both feel uncomfortable with, and that's the screenplay itself. It did win an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay by the playwright himself, adapted his own screenplay, Alfred Uhry. To me, the screenplay is the real hiccup as far as I'm concerned. First, in terms of structure, I feel like it's so episodic that it never really seems to find its rhythm or momentum. And as a result, nothing really gets explored in a satisfactory manner. Things just get suggested, and then we jump ahead another 5 or 10 years.
Well, that's a problem with the entire endeavor of the film. I mean, this is a turbulent time in American history. I mean, it covers 1948 to 1973, and it just dips its toes or even just barely glances at all the racial issues going on at the time.
That's exactly my point.
It's definitely problematic, but I'm sure the play was like that.
I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm just reacting to the movie itself. Devin, you're going to disagree with this, I presume.
I do disagree. I fundamentally disagree. I think that this is one of those styles of storytelling that is a bit of a lost art. It's I think it's a shame that it is. I think that there's something about, and you can go ahead and drink if you want, the simplicity of choosing to comment on these larger social issues through the prism of this very sheltered family that is mostly not having to confront those issues head on. And there's something very powerful about that. That theme gets encapsulated when they have her at the Martin Luther King speech. He talks about how we're so used to looking at the frothy waters of turbulent times like those, and the frothy part is the violence, the hatred, when in fact the vast majority of the human population during those same turbulent times is just living their darn lives. And that's one of the things he says in that speech. There's an obligation, there's a responsibility for people who are not part of the froth of the turbulent time. In that speech, I think you're hearing an encapsulation of the larger theme of this entire story, of this entire film, of this entire play. Let's look at the people who are just the regular people who represent millions of others like them, who weren't necessarily the big, hateful, violent people, nor were they the big heroes making speeches. They're just the regular people trying to navigate this.
I see that, and certainly the counter argument to my point would be they were trying to address these issues in a more subtle manner, and I think we'll open that can of worms when we get to the T word. But my counter argument to that is that doesn't make it not boring. For me, that same concept could have been done without covering 25 years, and I feel like it might have been potentially more effective. James, do you have a counter argument?
I agree. It doesn't make for drama. I'm fine with having an island of a film in a small world. It didn't just shy away from, the grander sociological issues, events of this time, but it shied away from potential for change, which we love in dramas, and major conflict, and getting to know these characters more. I mean, there seemed to be a lot of lost opportunities. I mean, I felt like that we were leading up to a climax in that MLK event scene where she doesn't invite him into the thing to the last minute, and he ends up sitting in the car listening to it. I thought, oh, we're probably finally gonna have some kind of blow up here, and something's gonna happen here. Or I thought another opportunity was when the temple was bombed, and she's upset about not getting there in time, and he tells this story about knowing 2 people got lynched, and it was graphic detail. And she just like dismisses it, and we move on. To speak to your point about the episodic nature of this film was like a series of episodes that started with scenes that had like a kernel of potential, but before they got really started and got boiling, we moved on.
The counter argument to that, if Alfred Urey was here, he would say, well, this is my grandma, and this is my grandma's driver, and this is how it was, and it's more realistic. And that might be true. However, I still found it boring. I mean, and that's the ultimate point here is like, I understand what they're going for. It's potentially more realistic to not have those blowups that you want. You know, maybe that is a little more honest potentially, but at the same time, especially given the amount of times that it happened and the ground that they're covering, I felt like I never got interested.
It's kind of an anomaly for a play. If a play proceeds like that, most classic plays that are most effective take place in real time, and they don't cover this kind of ground. This is very cinematic of a play to have all these years covered.
The movie does not turn out to be as cinematic somehow because it was limited to Devin's point. So Devin, I tried to make your point for you. I don't know if I did it the way you wanted me to.
Well, I would just focus in on 2 things. One, in that scene when she's so oblivious and has him sit in the car and listen on the radio while she goes into the dinner, he closes the door and walks around the car to let her out of her door. And in those seconds of him being by himself out of earshot from her, he does say a line that's quite climactic. Yes, it's small. Yes, it's slice of life. But he says things haven't really changed all that much. He counters what she just said to defend herself in the back seat and says, yeah, no, no. And
it counts as climactic for this movie, certainly.
well, that brings me to my second point, which is the climax or the point is seeing that what's crept up on you as you watch this story is that these 2 regular people who are both flawed, who are neither saints nor devils, found this bond. She's still not an enlightened, woke person by 2019 standards when she's super old at the end, but she did learn something, and he knew that, and their affection built organically. And when they're in that home at the end, they just forgive each other, and they say that one line, she's doing the best she can, and he says, I guess that's really all it's about. It's all we can do. Yes, that might be relatively small kind of resolution and not a particularly innovative one. It's not one that we haven't seen before. But I think it's a beautiful moment, and it's beautifully told.
And well, this is a segue to the other. As I feel like the cat is not in. He's like peering in the edge of frame in a weird way. I wish you'd either come in more or go out more. At just being a little directory for a second. That brings me to the next thing, which is the other reason, the main reason perhaps that I feel like the movie doesn't work for me, and that's the tone itself. Because I feel like the tone of the script, and as captured by the director, as I'm being distracted now by the cat here. The movie is very sweet, but might be a little too sweet for its own good. Perhaps best exemplified by its very famous "You're my best friend" moment. That to me is the low point of the movie, even though it was meant to be a high point. It leaves the kind of a sting you feel after a gulp of cotton candy. Saccharine, wince-worthy, and at no fault to the actors. They make it really for themselves. It's still cheesy in concept, and the film is constantly walking that line, and not always successfully. Sometimes more successfully, but especially in the latter half, it gets a little too corny for its own good. So all of those little victories that you're talking about, those moments that they're trying to be subtle and more realistic, but ultimately it comes off to me as a little cheesy. It undercuts that attempt at being more realistic.
Made that moment corny or cheesy is if she looked up at him and was like, Hoke, you're my best friend. And if he looked down at her and was like, you're damn right I am, Miss Daisy.
I just said the actors made it real for themselves. It could have been a lot worse, but to me, it was still bad.
In that scene, it's not this saccharine moment of them realizing, oh, wow, we have this amazing bond. How lovely. It's actually this bittersweet moment in which they're both freaking lonely, and they're both old and lonely and don't have a lot. You have the juxtaposition of they've come across all these years and they've become unlikely friends despite all those bizarre social constructs around them that would have dictated otherwise. And that's an achievement, and that's a victory. But also, it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory because they're both still lonely, old figures who are not particularly happy and have to be given that perspective from one of the only other people in their lives who they relate to at all. She doesn't relate to her son, and he doesn't relate to his family. It doesn't seem like as much.
That's true, but that doesn't make the moment any less corny. I mean, like I felt it was a little over the top, and furthermore, all that stuff about their age, I think, was approached in such a way where it was more to the people involved or it seemed to be more about the fact that she had finally looked past race to see Hoke as a man instead of as a black man, potentially, and just Hoke, incidentally. But so I think that's more what it was about, and the bittersweetness of it was lost in the process. James?
I mean, I'm not going to comment on the cheesiness. That's, up to personal opinion. I think, as in cinema, images speak louder than words. And I think the takeaway from the final scene for me is that image of him feeding her the pie, which I found touching, at least. It is ironic that she's finally saying something explicitly kind, but that they're at the end of their lives and she has dementia. So it took her having Alzheimer's, basically, for her to finally be nice to the guy. After the audience, at least me, has become kind of impatient, long ago, with kind of her one-note verbal abuse. And the other irony is he is still a paid friend. He's still getting paid by Booley to be there with her. So that's another irony that kind of makes it disheartening.
To your point about the visuals, I do think that the way it was shot adds to what the cheesiness of that particular moment. We're dissecting this one moment maybe a little too much, but cutting to the close-ups of the hand and each of them, while the music swells, like is part of what adds to this issue with tone.
That's only an issue if you're missing some of the subtext. I think that I was feeling what I think the filmmaker was going for in that moment, which is, holy crap, after all these years and after previous scenes before this, it didn't take the Alzheimer's. There were previous scenes where she was starting to recognize him as a human being more, with an inner life just like her own. And yet, despite the fact that they had already had years of connection, this is the first moment after knowing each other 20 years that they actually touched.
But Devin, all that can be there and it still be executed in a poor, over-the-top fashion. You know what I mean? Like, I understand what the intention was. I just don't think they got it for me. And that's my prerogative. Like, it did not make me feel anything. It made me roll my eyes. So, you could argue that's my problem, maybe. But, I mean, like, this is about how I reacted to the movie. And all those things that you're telling me I felt, I did not feel them. I did not feel touched at all. I felt annoyed and robbed of what it could have been for me.
I kind of felt the same way, just because by that, as I pointed out, by that time in the film, we're at the end, I had lost patience with the characters. And I get that seems to be the point of the whole film, but I wish that moment had happened halfway through the film. Then where do we go after that? After they've developing some affection,
that's the question.
Then we have an interesting drama. It kind of reminded me of I haven't seen it in years, but Remains of the Day, another one of these frustrating lack of action relationship films.
Well, obviously, I was involved with that company, and I like the film.
Okay.
But that's an example of a movie that has sort of a Proustian pace.
Yeah.
But what works for me, and it also covers a good amount of time, but it moves even quicker than this, and I think it's significantly more cinematic. I'm ready to move on to the T word, which is going to be even more explosive, I bet. Devin, is there anything more you need to say before we T word it?
No, I think it's actually related to the T word discussion. The T word.
I agree. So let's make it official. Here's the T word, where we talk about themes. It was always Davey's least favorite thing, but now we have come to embrace it. So we're even allowed to say the word themes, which we weren't used to because it scared Davey so much. That's why it's called the T word. The very obvious theme of this movie, or at least I think it's obvious, and we'll see what these guys think, is prejudice against both blacks and Jews. But in both scenarios, I feel like the film barely scratches the surface. Even though I know there's a lot of truth to the story of the things that happen to Alfred Urie's grandmother, sometimes it feels a little too easy on its subject matter. The aforementioned modern comparison, Green Book, deals with similar issues in a more head-on nature, and the consolidated time frame of that narrative makes it more successful, though possibly less realistic. And that's my opinion. Maybe the subtlety of Driving Miss Daisy is more honest. After all, does her appreciation for Hoke extend to the rest of his race? That's not clear, and maybe that's okay. But the result for me is a slightly less interesting and less impactful film. I guess it makes sense to do Devin first because he's going to be the counterpoint. Are you at least agree that prejudice is the key theme?
Yes.
So now you're going to disagree with everything else I had to say.
Pretty much, yes. The reason why the subtlety of this film makes it a far superior film to Green Book, in my view, is it's dealing with the evolution of our culture, not just realistically, but because it's realistic, it's dealing with it in a way that is more impactful. Instead of being corny and cheesy and spoon feeding us, here's what this means, and here's someone getting to know somebody
Impact
or whatever.
Impactfulness is such a subjective thing. I did not feel any impact, and if we're comparing the films, Green Book was far more entertaining, far more enjoyable to watch, but still dealt with a lot of the same issues, and therefore was more impactful for me. I did not feel anything here. So my point is the word impactful is subjective.
Sure. I think that the reason why more people would be impacted by this film.
Oh, I think you're wrong about that. I think you're off. You're assuming everyone's you. I bet you the world's more 50-50. In fact, even on this little microcosm, you're in the minority.
That's fair. In the movie, in Green Book, and I wasn't entertained at all because within the first 15 minutes, I felt so insulted. My intelligence felt so insulted that I just completely
also bear in mind, I'm far less intelligent than you, and therefore was much more entertained.
Okay. I felt that it was a huge step back for racial relations in this country that did as well as it did.
How is it a step back? I mean, it's a different discussion. Maybe it's off camera. How is it a step back? I don't understand that at all.
Because I think it's a slap in the face to people in the African American community who've been trying to garner more sophisticated discussion about what's wrong in this country. And here was this period piece that makes it seem like, oh yeah, it's still just this simple thing of back in the 50s. We just have to learn how to say.
I don't think so at all. I think the whole point of the film was to draw comparisons to modern day culture. It certainly
do that.
It was a period piece. So should period pieces not be made anymore because it's not as relevant? I mean, I think it's just as relevant.
The period nature of it is not the issue. What I'm saying is that it took place in that period and didn't have any more sophistication about the issue than someone in that time period would have had.
By what barometer are you measuring that sophistication? I don't understand.
This is supposed to be charming because look at how much more privileged I am, and yet I'm the black one. It had this sort of really cheap prescription, really old school 1950s prescription for how we're all supposed to get along and learn how to get along, and completely misses.
So, point being, you missed the nuance, is what you're saying. You did not see the nuance of the film.
I saw some attempts at nuance, but I didn't see any nuance that gave it any complexity or sophistication.
I disagree, but I mean, like, those are words that we might define differently: complexity and sophistication. James, how about my theme here?
Prejudice. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's touching on that, and linked to that, I mean, for me, the film shows that change can happen very slowly, and it speaks to Devin's point about the film being about these micro steps. But for me, change happened so slowly in this film; it was glacial.
Maybe it's all about the time frame, because is that the issue in Green Book? Is it disingenuous that these two men in Green Book would connect in that short a period of time?
No,
It
I don't
makes
think so.
it-
In terms of like characters I wanted to watch, I think Green Book has a slight edge.
It's funny because I feel like the problems that you and I are having towards Driving Miss Daisy are the same problems that Devin's regurgitating back to us as far as Green Book's concerned, in terms of what worked for each of us. So Devin, my question to you about Green Book is, it almost sounds like the story is something that happened, somebody came across it, and wanted to make it into a movie. Because of the very nature of the story, should it not even have been made?
I think that story could have been told, but I don't think, number one, now is the right time to tell it. And number two, I think that it was executed poorly.
Directorially speaking.
Yes.
I disagree with that too. I don't think that made any magic, but I also didn't think he tried to force anything, which is what I appreciate. And that's a difference, I feel like, between the two movies. There was nothing that bumped for me in the same way.
There's a obliviousness to the filmmaker's treatment of the subject matter in Green Book. Jessica Tandy's character in Driving Miss Daisy has that same obliviousness. There's a privilege to the way that the filmmaker of Green Book approaches that material.
How do you garner that from a movie? Like, how do you know inside the head of a filmmaker like that?
It consistently has that tone of, look at how good we're being, learning how to not be racist.
I'm not sure I find fault in learning not to be racist. That's a good thing. To your point earlier, this is a movie that takes place in a different time when people were racist. And so the job of the filmmaker was to depict that, and then depict one, a couple
Well, that
men's
speaks to
journey.
the first point I made, which is that it was the wrong time to release that film and to release that story.
I know, but films get made when they get made. You know what I mean? Like, it sometimes things get lucky and sometimes things they don't. I mean, like, but it's not like it did poorly either. You know what I mean? It was a right time for some people.
It was. I disagree with all of those people.
I mean, I agree that Green Book did appeal to people who wanted to be able to watch the film and pat themselves on the back about how enlightened they are and how enlightened the white character is in the film. But I think Driving Miss Daisy has the same issue. I mean, I assume you look at the makeup of the Academy back then, mostly white people patted themselves on the back by making this the best picture. In the same year where we have one of the most talked about films that dealt with racial relations in America, Do the Right Thing. It wasn't just about, the greater picture ignored, which is fine. I'm fine, like I said, with island films. But there's so much between these characters that is unexplored. I think we can all agree we're not meant to be aligned with Miss Davies' point of view in this film, but I think the filmmakers are. It's such from their perspective. I wish we had a more God's eye view, because at the end, it would have driven in the disheartening impact of the irony of how little Miss Daisy and her son made the effort to get to know this guy they'd employed for years and at the end befriended for years. I mean, at the very end, he mentions his daughter is in her 30s now, and her career success. And this is news to Booley. Did Miss Daisy ever ask about his family?
There was a rose-colored element to the tone. That's sort of what I was hinting at earlier. To be honest, like, there's not much separating Driving Miss Daisy and Green Book. I think in a lot of the things that we're saying overlap. There's concentric circles. I mean, the only difference is for me is that I found one more entertaining, and partially because the narrative was condensed. Before I move on to the brackets, I want to give these guys a chance because Prejudice was the only theme that I came up with. Was there more to this movie that we didn't discuss thematically?
Generations. They kept coming back to her photograph in 1896 when she was graduating from school. And at least 5 or 6 times we saw that photograph. And
I don't recall.
I think that was purposeful. There's only so much change we can accomplish in a single lifetime. And so that's why the two themes are connected. The idea of how limited we are in a single lifetime, how much understanding we can gain, how much we can grow. There's a certain generational limitation depending on what generation we're born into.
I was going to say it depends, because I feel like she was alive for 90 years and very little changed, but a lot changed within the 50 years since.
Yeah, I think in terms of a story that was being told here, it's mostly about the thread of her lifetime. You can look at all the externals that were happening during that lifetime, but you can also look in a simple film like this from inside the brain of a single human being that's living during those incrementally changing times.
James, how are you in this generational theme?
Well, it relates to the theme I brought up earlier about kind of glacial change. And I thought maybe a better director could have made this all more impactful, like I say, giving us more of a God's eye view, giving a snippet of not only Hoke's life, but also what's happening out in the world, because that would have been an impactful compare and contrast with how glacial and stubborn Miss Daisy is. We start this story when Miss Daisy's like in her early 70s or late 60s, I think. By that time, the stereotype is people are pretty stubborn and set in their ways. Same with my grandma. She's a big fan of tennis, loves Roger Federer, not a fan of Serena Williams. She never says it, but I think it's because of the color of her skin. Yeah. And it's, she's from a generation that was more prejudiced.
Yeah, no, I mean, my grandmother was like the sweetest woman, and my friend Abby and I were talking about this the other day. She was like the sweetest woman you ever met, but she was very racist, and it always bothered me, and it just didn't compute with how kind she was to the rest of the world.
But I think it was very intentional and part of the playwright and screenwriter to show us how little Miss Daisy changed. I just read the screenplay, and the screenplay hangs a lantern multiple times on how little the interior of Miss Daisy's house has changed.
Yeah.
And he also hangs a lantern on how every couple of years she gets a new car, but it's basically the exact replica of her previous car.
Yeah.
And so I think that's hammering in kind of this lack of change on this personal level, no matter what's happening in the outside world.
Okay, let's get through to the classic movie showdown. The brackets are back. And that's something that Devin can at least get excited about, because he is the person who has voted on the most brackets of all time historically.
I'll take it.
Wow.
All right, so we always start the bracket discussion by reminding you what the rules are. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to ask one of these guys to read it. I'm just going to read the rules. And here they are now. Seating criteria varies from bracket to bracket. The films are at screenings hosted by me, and they need to be 15 years or older, which of this year is 2004. Voters are eligible if they see both films within a 12-month period, which in this case, James was. Voters must see both films in my presence. And I am an eligible vote, but I do break ties, which was not necessary in this particular vote. This is where it gets kind of exciting. So we are doing the Best Actress bracket tonight. Obviously, Jessica Tandy won Best Actress in 1989. So it's an 11 seed in the Best Actress bracket. It has a lot of 64 of the Best Actress winners in history in the bracket. And so that means, Devin, it goes up against
number 6.
A 6 seed. So here you go, ladies and gentlemen. What 6 seed will David and Miss Daisy go up against in the Best Actress bracket? It is, Mary Poppins. 1964 Best Actress winner for Julie Andrews. And one thing that people always ask me, Devin, whenever we do one of the acting brackets, Best Actor brackets, Best Actress, Supporting, etc., are we voting on the performance or the film itself? And Devin, what do I tell people?
It's up to the voter.
It's up to the voter to use your own criteria. James was at that screening, so I'm going to let him go first. James, what do you vote there? Driving Miss Daisy versus Mary Poppins.
Wow, that's a tough one. Such different films and requirements. I mean, Julie Andrews had to sing as well as act. It was a better script, Mary Poppins. I would much rather rewatch Mary Poppins than Driving Miss Daisy, that's for sure. In this case, I'm going to give it to the person who elevated kind of a C- script, to like a B- film. Whereas Mary Poppins had more out of the gate, giving the actress more of an advantage. I'm going to say Tandy did such a good job at fleshing out this character as much as she could, given extreme limitations. So I'm going to give it to Tandy.
Okay, you say Driving Miss Daisy. Let's see what Devin has to say. And
It's a close one. I mean, I've often said these are two very similar performances.
You've often said that historically, eh?
It's just historically Jessica Tandy and Driving Miss Daisy and Julie Andrews and Mary Poppins. It comes up a lot. No,
Does it? It's a common party discussion.
Yeah, and also Driving Miss Daisy often gets compared to Drive. With Ryan Gosling. Yeah. No, I do think this is a tough call because there was so much about Julie Andrews' performance that was a remarkable achievement, the same way that the film is such a remarkable achievement. But overall, everything else being equal and counting all the variables of decades later, what we require of our actors in these performances, overall, give it to Jessica Tandy by a nose.
I of course, did not vote. It was not a tie. I didn't need to vote. But I didn't remember, looking back, what the audience in 2017 chose. I had to look it up, and I'm going to reveal it right now. The winner and the Best Actress Driving Miss Daisy versus Mary Poppins was Driving Miss Daisy. The audience agreed with you. And I think, as I vaguely recall, it was largely about the difference of time period. Jessica Tandy was creating a realistic person. You know, the acting styles of the periods landed differently for the audiences. So Driving Miss Daisy won. I remember it being close.
Yes.
James, how do you feel?
Totally vindicated.
If it were any other bracket, I feel like people would have voted for Mary Poppins, but they did seem to look at performance versus performance, and that's how Tandy came up on top. For my portion of it, though, I acknowledge how close it is, and I also agree that it's close, and I didn't get to vote, but I will opine for you now. I personally would have gone for Mary Poppins. I actually think there's a challenge to what Julie Andrews is doing in creating character as fantastic as she is. I don't mean great. I mean like living in a fantasy world. Something about making that character grounded, and to this point, it's also a more iconic character historically, especially as played by Julie Andrews. So it's more iconic performance, I think it's fair to say. That, when looking at the two close performances, might have pushed it towards Mary Poppins for me personally. Devin, are you angry again?
No, that's totally fair perspective. I don't disagree with it. That's why it was by a nose for me. I agree that Julie Andrews had to do certain things with those different expectations of the time period, and created that iconic character, and that takes an extra special gift. So yeah, I don't disagree on that. For me, Tandy just took it by a hair.
And it's time for closing thoughts. James, any closing thoughts about tonight's episode and the show?
Well, we talked a lot about the kind of the ironies of this film. And for me, perhaps a better director could have made more out of this. But I think one of the greatest tragic ironies of the evening is this film won Best Picture in a year of amazing films, including a classic, Dead Poets Society, including one of my favorite films, Crimes and Misdemeanors, including some real entertaining popcorn films like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I'm really happy to hear they're going to make a sequel to that film.
Yeah. Field of Dreams.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I thought I said that. Say Anything, another good popcorn film.
But I mean, the ultimate one, though, I mean,
but there's other films there are two other films we mentioned that dealt with race, and I think one of them really stood out, and it made a huge atomic bomb-sized impact, and that's Do the Right Thing. And I also want to go back and watch Glory again, because I remember that being a pretty gritty film and thoughtful and complicated about race as well. Those did not win, and the safe, incrementally paced film Daisy won.
One thing I think we might all agree on is that Do the Right Thing is the best film of 1989. I think maybe we can all agree on that.
Agreed.
Yeah.
In spite of all the fights. Maybe I'm not a racist as much anymore, Devin. All right, so that's James's closing thoughts. Devin.
No, I think we've covered a lot. I would say, to me, part of why this film holds up is because it gives us that slice of life reality and charm with a subtle reference to these larger cultural or social imperatives in a way that is remarkably needed today. I think it does a really solid job of that. This film brings us the character of Daisy as a way to all experience the ways that we're imperfect, the ways that we still need to evolve, also the ways that we need to look at each other the way the son character does, and choose our battles. And we're always going to have people who we think are wrong or who we think are doing something that's bad for our culture or bad for our society. And there are those moments in this film when he sees his mother and says, "Oh, geez, Mama," that's kind of, you know, he never comes out and says, "Mama, wow, you're prejudiced."
He insinuates it often.
And he kind of just has to still be an empathetic person and still be understanding and patient and not just condemn her. And he still loves her. And I think that that's a very important message still today, when we all want to bite each other's heads off, and we have to fight that, and we have to instead try to choose our battles, speak firmly when we need to, and this film gives us that message in a sophisticated, subtle way, with its realistic slice of life, charming story.
Time to do trivia for the next set of episodes. The next classic is coming up pretty soon, in a month or so. And their trivia is this: one of the pioneers of American independent cinema released his first film in the year James and I are studying, 1959. On our next classic, we'll look at the first of this director's films to get Oscar attention in the late 60s. So that is your trivia coming up on the next classic in about a month or so. So we will see you then. But next up, we've got a sound off coming up this upcoming Monday. It's our 40th sound off. Alex and James will be there. We're going to do a special announcement about the course of the show. Alex and I are going to report about our experience at TCM Fest. I'm going to do an obscure movie discovery for a film that I saw at TCM Fest. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, this meeting of the No Name Cinema Society is adjourned.